Bannack, Montana Territory, October 1864. When territorial physician Dr. Marcus Wainwright was called to examine the Donnelly family at their isolated homestead 15 miles outside Bannack, he expected to find scarlet fever or typhoid, the common killers of frontier families. 3 children had died within a week of each other, and the surviving family members were reportedly exhibiting strange symptoms that the local midwife couldn't identify. Wainwright had practiced medicine on the frontier for 12 years. He'd treated everything from gunshot wounds to cholera outbreaks. He considered himself prepared for any medical challenge the wilderness could present. What he discovered at the Donnelly homestead made him question whether he was observing a medical condition at all, or something that existed outside the boundaries of natural disease. The 3 dead children, aged 7, 9, and 11, showed no signs of infection or illness. Their bodies were unmarked, seemingly healthy, as if they'd simply decided to stop living. But it was the surviving family members that truly disturbed Wainwright. All 6 of them, parents and 3 remaining children, were exhibiting the same inexplicable symptoms. Their eyes had changed color. Not gradually, as sometimes happens in infancy, but suddenly and simultaneously. All 6 family members who had brown eyes 3 weeks earlier now had eyes that appeared almost colorless, a pale gray that seemed to reflect light unnaturally, making them glow faintly in dim illumination. Their skin had become unusually sensitive, blistering from even brief sun exposure. And, most disturbing, they had begun to move in ways that seemed coordinated, as if choreographed, even when they weren't looking at each other or communicating verbally. But what made Wainwright immediately send for territorial authorities was what he found in the family's root cellar. Journals. Dozens of them, dating back over 80 years, written in different hands across 3 generations, all documenting the same phenomena. The Donnelly family had been experiencing these changes periodically for decades. They'd been dying and transforming, and exhibiting symptoms that defied medical explanation since before they'd arrived in America. And they'd been keeping meticulous records of every occurrence, documenting their own genetic deterioration with the precision of scientists observing an experiment they couldn't control. Before we continue with the story of the Donnelly family and the genetic curse that science still cannot explain, we need you to join this investigation. Subscribe to Liturgy of Fear and hit that notification bell, because stories like this, where heredity produces something impossible according to all known laws of biology, deserve to be told. Leave a comment telling us what you think. We want to know if you believe genetic memory can carry more than just physical traits, or if some families carry curses written into their very blood. What happened to the Donnelly family in 1864 didn't begin in Montana. It began in Ireland, in County Cork, in the 1780s, with events that the family's journals describe in fragmentary, terrified entries that suggest horrors the writers couldn't fully articulate. The Donnelly family history, reconstructed from the journals discovered in their Montana homestead, traces back to a man named Seamus Donnelly, who lived in a village called Ballycotton on Ireland's southern coast. Seamus was a fisherman, married with 4 children, living an ordinary life until March 1783, when he and 3 other fishermen encountered something in the waters off the coast that the journals describe only as the thing that should not surface. The entry describing this encounter was written by Seamus's wife, Moira, 2 weeks after the fishing boat returned with only 2 of the 4 men aboard. Seamus and another fisherman named Patrick O'Brien had survived. The other 2 men were simply gone, with no explanation the survivors would provide beyond claiming they'd gone into the water and become part of it. Seamus and Patrick returned changed. Their eyes had shifted from brown to that strange, pale gray. Their skin couldn't tolerate sunlight, and they moved strangely, with jerking motions that Moira described as like puppets being pulled by strings we cannot see. Within 3 months, both survivors were dead. But before dying, Seamus had passed whatever had changed him to his entire family. His wife, his 4 children, all of them exhibited the same symptoms: gray eyes, light sensitivity, strange coordinated movements. The children survived. Moira survived. But they were transformed in ways that never fully reverted. The journals document that these changes would subside somewhat over months or years, allowing the family to function relatively normally. Eyes would darken back toward brown, though never quite reaching their original color. Skin sensitivity would decrease. The coordinated movements would become less pronounced. But the changes never disappeared completely. And periodically, without warning or apparent cause, they would intensify again. Family members would die during intense periods. Others would survive but show more pronounced symptoms. The pattern continued through generations. Seamus's children grew to adulthood and had children of their own. Some descendants showed no symptoms initially. Others exhibited them from birth. But eventually, everyone with Donnelly blood manifested the changes to some degree. The family began to understand that whatever had happened to Seamus in 1783 had altered something fundamental in the family's heredity. They were carrying something in their blood, in their very genetic structure, that would be passed down through every generation. The family kept journals documenting every occurrence. They recorded births and noted whether children showed symptoms immediately or developed them later. They documented deaths and the circumstances surrounding them. They noted patterns, trying to understand what triggered intensification of symptoms. They were conducting genetic research decades before Mendel would establish the principles of heredity, driven by desperate need to understand what was destroying their family line. In 1816, a branch of the Donnelly family emigrated to America, settling first in Boston. The journals from this period show the family hoped that leaving Ireland might somehow break whatever curse or condition afflicted them. It didn't. The symptoms continued in America exactly as they had in Ireland. More children were born. Some died young. Others survived with symptoms that made them outcasts, even in America's more tolerant social environment. By 1840, the American Donnellys had moved west to Ohio, seeking isolation and land where they could live without constant scrutiny from neighbors disturbed by their appearance and behavior. The family patriarch at this time was Michael Donnelly, grandson of one of Seamus's surviving children. Michael was 35 years old, married to a woman named Catherine, who had no Donnelly blood and showed no symptoms. They had 7 children, 4 of whom exhibited the Donnelly traits to varying degrees. Michael's journals from the Ohio period are particularly detailed. He had educated himself in anatomy and medicine, desperate to understand what was happening to his family. He theorized that whatever had changed Seamus in 1783 had somehow altered the family's essential nature at a level deeper than physical traits. He wrote of something in the blood that remembers, of a change that was more than body and less than soul, existing in the space between. Michael attempted various treatments. He consulted with physicians, who were uniformly baffled. He tried bloodletting, hoping to purge whatever contaminated the family line. It only weakened them, without affecting symptoms. He tried various medicinal compounds, herbs and minerals that medical texts of the era suggested for blood disorders. Nothing changed. The condition wasn't a disease that could be cured. It was hereditary, written into the family structure at a level no treatment could reach. In 1858, Michael Donnelly led his family further west to Montana Territory, which had just been opened to settlement. He purchased land near Bannock, far from any established communities, where the family could live without interference. He built a substantial homestead with enough space to isolate family members during intensification periods, when symptoms became impossible to conceal. Michael's plan was to allow his children to marry outside the family, hoping that diluting Donnelly blood might weaken the condition over generations. Some children did marry non-Donnellys. Others married within the extended family, which was common on the frontier, where marriage prospects were limited. The journals document the results. Children from marriages with non-Donnellys showed fewer symptoms, though symptoms never disappeared completely. Children from marriages within the family showed intensified symptoms, often dying young. By 1864, Michael was 59 years old. He and Catherine had 23 grandchildren living on the homestead or on adjacent properties. The Donnelly compound had become a small settlement unto itself, a cluster of families united by blood and by the shared condition that made them different from normal humanity. Then came the intensification of 1864. It began in September. Michael's journals document the onset with clinical precision, mixed with growing horror. On September 12th, all family members with Donnelly blood, approximately 30 people across 4 generations, experienced simultaneous symptoms. Eyes changing color overnight, skin sensitivity appearing within hours, and the coordinated movements becoming so pronounced that the family members seemed to be performing an elaborate dance without conscious thought. 3 children died within the first week, ages 7, 9, and 11. All healthy before the intensification. All dead without apparent cause. Their bodies showed no disease. Their organs were normal. They had simply ceased living, as if whatever animated them had withdrawn, leaving empty shells that looked like sleeping children. Michael documented everything, maintaining his scientific approach, even as his grandchildren died. He noted that the 3 children who died had been born from marriages between Donnellys, that they'd shown strong symptoms from birth, that they've been more connected to whatever the family carried than children born from mixed marriages. He theorized that some threshold had been reached, that the concentration of whatever was in Donnelly blood had become too intense in these children, killing them when the intensification occurred. The surviving family members were changing in other ways, beyond the standard symptoms. They reported shared dreams, all experiencing the same visions simultaneously. They described seeing vast, dark water, feeling immense pressure as if drowning, encountering presences in the depths that were aware of them, and watching them with interest that felt predatory. Michael documented these reports but couldn't explain them. The shared dreaming suggested the family was connected through something beyond normal heredity. That whatever was in their blood created bonds between family members that went beyond physical relationship. Most disturbing, the family members were beginning to remember things they shouldn't be able to remember. Michael's daughter Mary, age 32, suddenly began describing events from Seamus Donnelly's life in 1783, with details she couldn't have known. She'd never been to Ireland. She'd never read the earliest journals, which Michael kept locked away. Yet she could describe Ballycotton, could describe the fishing boat, could describe with terrible clarity what Seamus had encountered in the water that day 81 years earlier. Other family members were experiencing similar spontaneous memories. They were remembering lives they hadn't lived, events they hadn't witnessed, experiencing the accumulated history of every Donnelly who had ever carried the condition. It was as if genetic memory, which normally carries only biological information, had somehow expanded to include consciousness, experience, and knowledge from previous generations. Dr. Wainwright arrived on October 3rd, called by a neighbor who'd heard about the deaths and reported them to authorities. Wainwright examined the 3 dead children first. He found nothing to explain their deaths. No poison, no disease, no injury. They were simply dead, as if life had been withdrawn from them by some mechanism medicine couldn't identify. Then, he examined the surviving family members. The grey eyes, the light-sensitive skin, the coordinated movements. He'd never seen anything like it in 12 years of frontier practice. He questioned Michael extensively about family history. Michael, recognizing that concealment was no longer possible, showed Wainwright the journals. All of them. 81 years of documentation, spanning 4 generations. Wainwright spent 3 days at the Donnelly homestead, reading journals, examining family members, trying to construct a medical explanation for what he was observing. He found none. The family's condition didn't match any disease in his medical texts. It wasn't infection. It wasn't poison. It wasn't any form of hereditary illness he knew of. It was something else. Something that medical science in 1864 had no framework for understanding. Just when we thought we'd seen it all, the Donnelly family's condition reaches its critical phase. If this story is affecting you, share this video with someone who appreciates medical mysteries. Hit that like button to support our content, and subscribe to never miss stories like this. Let's discover together what happened when a frontier doctor confronted a genetic impossibility. Because what occurred in the following weeks would change everything. Wainwright wanted to bring in specialists. He wanted to transport family members to larger medical facilities in San Francisco, or even back east, where more sophisticated examination could be conducted. Michael refused. He'd spent his entire life avoiding exactly that kind of scrutiny. He knew that if medical authorities examined his family, the Donnellys would become specimens, objects of study, rather than people. They would be confined, experimented upon, treated as curiosities rather than human beings suffering from an affliction they couldn't control. But Wainwright had already reported the case to territorial authorities. By late October, 2 more physicians had arrived at the Donnelly homestead, sent by the territorial governor to investigate reports of an unknown contagion. Dr. Samuel Henderson from Virginia City and Dr. William Cole from Helena examined the family independently and reached the same conclusion Wainwright had. This wasn't disease. This wasn't anything their medical training had prepared them to treat. The 3 physicians held a conference at the homestead on October 26th. Their discussion, documented in Wainwright's journals discovered years later, reveals physicians confronting the limits of their knowledge. Henderson suggested the family was suffering from exposure to some unknown substance, perhaps a toxin in the water or soil that accumulated over generations. Cole argued for a hereditary condition, something passed through bloodlines that medical science hadn't yet identified. Wainwright believed they were observing something that existed outside normal biological principles entirely, though he couldn't articulate what that something might be. While the physicians debated, the family's condition was intensifying. By late October, all Donnelly family members were exhibiting extreme symptoms. Eyes that glowed faintly, even in daylight. Skin that blistered from moonlight as well as sunlight. Movements so synchronized that they seemed to be controlled by a single consciousness operating 30 bodies. And the shared memories were becoming overwhelming. Family members would suddenly speak in unison, describing events from generations past in perfect detail. They would move together through the homestead, as if performing a ritual whose choreography they all knew instinctively. They would gather in the central cabin at night and stand in formations that seemed meaningful, but that no one watching could interpret. Michael's final journal entries from this period show a man losing hope, but maintaining scientific discipline until the end. He wrote, "We are remembering things we have never known. We are becoming what Seamus became when he touched whatever exists in those dark waters. The changes are no longer periodic. They are permanent. We are crossing some threshold, becoming something other than human, or perhaps revealing what we have actually been since 1783. The children are dying first, because they carry the most concentrated blood. We who are older, more diluted, will last longer. But we are all dying, or transforming. I am no longer certain there is a difference." On November 4th, 1864, 4 more children died, ages 5, 8, 12, and 14. All died simultaneously during the night, with no apparent cause. Their parents found them in the morning, arranged in a circle in the central cabin, holding hands, looking peaceful, but utterly lifeless. Michael documented this in his final entry. 7 children dead now, the youngest of the pure blood. They are being taken first, or they are leaving first, returning to whatever source we all came from in 1783. the rest of us will follow. I have failed to understand this, failed to cure it, failed to protect my family. But I have documented it. Whoever finds these journals, know that the Donnelly family carried something in our blood that was not human, was never human, was something that used human form, but remained fundamentally other. We tried to be normal. We tried to live as people. But we were always dying, or transforming, or returning home to places we had never been. Tell our story. Document that we existed. Remember that humanity has boundaries, and some of us exist on the wrong side of those boundaries, looking in, but never quite belonging. That was Michael Donnelly's last entry. Dr. Wainwright visited the homestead on November 7th and found it abandoned, completely abandoned. All 37 family members were gone. Their belongings remained. Food was still in the kitchen. Beds were made. Clothes were folded. But every person with Donnelly blood had disappeared. Wainwright searched the property extensively. He found no signs of violence, no indication where the family had gone. He discovered the journals hidden in the root cellar and spent the next week reading them, piecing together the family's history. He reported his findings to territorial authorities, who organized search parties to locate the missing family. The search parties found nothing. 37 people had simply vanished. From an isolated Montana homestead, without leaving tracks, without being seen by neighbors, without any evidence of where they'd gone or what had happened to them. The search continued for months, eventually expanding across Montana territory and into neighboring regions. No trace of the Donnelly family was ever found. The homestead was sealed by authorities and remained undisturbed for decades. The journals were confiscated and classified as medical records stored in territorial archives. When Montana achieved statehood in 1889, the journals were transferred to state medical archives, where they remained forgotten for nearly a century. In 1968, a medical historian named Dr. Patricia Brennan was researching frontier medicine for a book she was writing. She discovered references to the Donnelly case in old territorial records and requested access to the journals. What she read convinced her that the case represented something significant, either a hereditary condition that medical science still hadn't identified, or documentation of something that existed outside biological principles entirely. Brennan published excerpts from the journals in 1970 in a medical history journal. The publication attracted immediate attention from geneticists who recognized that the Donnelly case, if authentic, represented a genetic mystery without precedent. Hereditary conditions that produce physical symptoms across generations are well documented, but hereditary transmission of memories, of coordinated behavior across distances, of changes that seem to transcend normal biological mechanisms. These things shouldn't be possible according to any known genetic principles. Modern geneticists have attempted to analyze the case using contemporary knowledge. Some have suggested the Donnellys suffered from a rare form of porphyria, a group of genetic disorders that cause light sensitivity and neurological symptoms. But porphyria doesn't explain the eye color changes, the coordinated movements, the shared memories. Or most importantly, the simultaneous onset of symptoms across an entire family. Others have proposed that the family was exposed to some environmental toxin that accumulated over generations, causing genetic mutations. But toxins don't cause the kind of coordinated, seemingly purposeful changes the Donnellys exhibited. And toxins don't explain how family members who'd never been to Ireland could remember events from Irish ancestors' lives with perfect accuracy. Some researchers have suggested mass psychological phenomenon, that the family was experiencing shared delusions documented as real by physicians who were themselves affected by suggestion or frontier superstition. But the journals were written by multiple people, across multiple generations, all describing consistent symptoms. Mass delusion doesn't produce consistent physical changes, observable by multiple independent physicians. The most controversial explanations come from researchers who've studied both the journals and the historical context. Some have noted that Ballycotton, where Seamus Donnelly encountered the thing that should not surface, is located near unusually deep ocean trenches. They've speculated that Seamus might have encountered some form of deep-sea life unknown to science, something with properties that could somehow alter human biology through contact. Others have proposed that the Donnelly family carried genes from some non-human source, that somewhere in their ancestry, something had been introduced that wasn't quite human. This explanation ventures into speculative biology that mainstream science rejects, but it remains the only hypothesis that accounts for all the documented symptoms. In 1993, a team of geneticists attempted to trace Donnelly descendants to see if any genetic anomalies could be identified. They found several families that claimed descent from Donnellys, who had married out of the main family line before 1864. DNA analysis showed these descendants carried unusual genetic markers that geneticists couldn't fully explain. The markers didn't correspond to any known genetic conditions, but they were present in all tested descendants, suggesting they represented something real rather than testing errors. Most intriguingly, several descendants reported experiencing mild versions of Donnelly symptoms: unusual light sensitivity, occasional shared dreams with family members, moments of remembering things they shouldn't be able to remember. These symptoms were much weaker than those documented in the journals, but they suggested that whatever the Donnellys carried in their blood hadn't disappeared completely. It had only been diluted through generations of marriage with non-Donnellys. The original Donnelly homestead in Montana still stands, though it's privately owned and not accessible to researchers. The current owners, who purchased the property in 2005, knowing nothing of its history, have reported unusual experiences. Sounds at night that seem like coordinated movement, occasional glimpses of figures that disappear when directly observed, dreams of dark water and pressure, and things watching from depths. These reports are anecdotal and unverified, but they contribute to the persistent sense that the Donnelly case represents something unresolved, something that science hasn't adequately explained or dismissed. The journals themselves are now housed at Montana State University archives, available to researchers, but rarely requested because of their disturbing content, and because mainstream science has largely dismissed the case as either fraud or misunderstood conventional conditions. The few researchers who've studied the journals extensively tend to conclude that whatever the Donnellys were experiencing was real, was genetic, and remains unexplained by any current biological framework. The fate of the 37 family members who disappeared in November 1864 remains unknown. Did they die somewhere on the Montana frontier, their bodies never discovered? Did they somehow return to Ireland, to Ballycotton, drawn back to where whatever changed them first emerged? Did they transform into something that couldn't survive in normal reality and simply cease to exist? The journals offer no answers. Michael Donnelly's final entry suggests he believed the family was returning to some source, but he couldn't specify what or where that source was. The physicians who examined the family had no explanation for their disappearance. The searches found no trace. The Donnellys simply vanished, leaving behind only their documentation of a genetic curse that science still cannot explain. What happened to the Donnelly family? Were they carrying some genuine genetic anomaly that medical science hasn't yet identified? Were they affected by environmental factors we don't understand? Or were they evidence of something more troubling? That heredity can carry more than just physical traits. That blood can remember things it experienced generations ago. That some families exist on boundaries between human and something else. The questions persist because the evidence persists. 81 years of documentation by multiple observers. Physical changes witnessed by trained physicians. Genetic markers in descendants that modern science can't explain. And most compellingly, the disappearance of 37 people without trace, as if they'd never existed at all. The Donnelly family challenges our understanding of what heredity means and what boundaries define human biology. They suggest that genetics might operate according to principles we don't yet understand. That family history might be written in blood, in ways more literal than we acknowledge. That some mysteries won't be solved until science expands its framework to include possibilities currently dismissed as impossible. What do you think happened to the Donnelly family? Were they carrying legitimate genetic anomalies that we simply lack the knowledge to identify? Or were they evidence of something that exists outside biology entirely? Something that used heredity as a vehicle, but remained fundamentally other than any natural condition? Leave your comment below. If you found this investigation compelling, subscribe and hit the notification bell. Share this with someone who appreciates medical mysteries that resist explanation. The stories that science cannot fully explain are often the ones most important to preserve. At Liturgy of Fear, we believe in documenting the unexplained honestly, acknowledging when knowledge reaches its limits, and preserving mysteries that may someday be solved, or may forever remain beyond human understanding. See you in the next video.